The night sky above the Suffolk coast was black enough to swallow the horizon. A steady wind off the North Sea pressed against the hangars at RAF Mildenhall, rattling corrugated metal like distant gunfire. It was August 25th, 1940, midway through the Battle of Britain, and all day the German Luftwaffe had hammered British airfields from the Channel to the Thames. Fires still burned in Essex. Rescue crews picked through smoking craters along the RAF perimeter. The war felt as though it was tightening around Britain's throat, yet inside Hangar 5 dim lanterns flickered over the dark silhouettes of 12 Wellington MKIC bombers from No. 3 Group. Ground crews hurried along the cold concrete with tool sets clinking at their sides. Armorers moved methodically from aircraft to aircraft, securing 500-pound general-purpose bombs into their cradles. They worked in silence. Everyone knew tonight's destination. It had circulated around the mess hall in whispers: Berlin. The heart of Nazi Germany, 580 miles away. The target was not a munitions factory or a dockyard. It was the capital itself, the symbolic center of Hitler's empire. No British aircraft had ever struck Berlin before. The Luftwaffe was certain such a feat was impossible. Across the tarmac, a heavy-set man in a leather flight coat adjusted the straps on his Me Westlife jacket. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Jack Hammond, age 27, commander of Wellington R 3173, stared out across the moonless sky. He had flown in France, evacuated at the last minute from a collapsing airfield near Lille. He had seen German bombs tearing apart runways, barracks, churches, and farms. But this was different. This was not defense. This was retaliation. A cold mist drifted across the open field as the crews assembled for the final briefing. The men filed into the low-lit operations room where a map table dominated the center. RAF Group Captain Norman Bottomley stood at the head of the room, his face carved with exhaustion. Chalk lines stretched from East Anglia to the Baltic, then toward a red circle around Berlin. Bottomley spoke softly, almost somberly. "Gentlemen, tonight the air staff has authorized a raid on the German capital. Germany has bombed London once already accidentally, they claim. Tonight we will answer." A ripple of tension moved through the room. The crews scribbled down headings and altitudes. Course to Denmark. Across the Baltic. Final run south toward the city center. Bombs away at 12,000 feet. Weather reports predicted storms over the North Sea. Navigation would be treacherous. German night fighters from JG-26 and JG-52 would be patrolling. At least 6 major flak belts ringed Berlin. The briefing officer cleared his throat as he concluded. "Expect heavy resistance. Godspeed, gentlemen." Back outside, the bombers were already warming their Pegasus engines. The air vibrated with the low, throaty growl of 12 machines preparing to leap into the darkness. Hammond climbed the small ladder into his Wellington, nodding to his crew navigator flight sergeant. William Holt, rear gunner sergeant, David Kellen, wireless operator, Corporal Sutton and Co., pilot officer Reeves. Each man carried the weight of fear in his eyes, though none admitted it aloud. Inside the cockpit, the faint bulwark light glowed across the instrument panels. The smell of fuel and oil clung to their uniforms. Hammond pulled on his headset. "Crew ready." A chorus of affirmatives crackled through the intercom. Right then he whispered to himself, "Let us give Berlin something to remember." At 21:50 hours, with the wind sweeping over East Anglia, the first Wellington lurched forward. One by one, the aircraft thundered down the darkened runway. Their engines roared into the night, casting brief shadows across the tarmac as they lifted into the void. Villagers in the countryside looked up from shuttered windows, hearing the rising thunder overhead. The silhouettes of the 12 bombers faded into the moonless sky, climbing toward cloud cover. Below them, Britain lay wounded but unbroken. Tonight was not about destruction. It was about signaling something far greater. Britain was still in the fight. The bombers leveled out at 10-0, 0 feet heading toward Denmark. The coastline slipped behind them. Only the dark sea remained. Far ahead, across hundreds of miles of storm-filled sky, lay the Nazi capital, and the moment the war would change course forever. The mission had begun. The origins of the RAF's first attack on Berlin did not begin with vengeance or bravado. They began with desperation. In the late summer of 1940, Britain stood virtually alone. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. Across the Channel, German divisions assembled for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But first, the Luftwaffe sought to crush the RAF, destroy airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. In July and August, the Battle of Britain raged over southern England. Fighter Command scrambled dozens of sorties a day. Pilots slept in their flight gear. Mechanics worked until their hands bled. Across the countryside, German bombs transformed quiet villages into landscapes of ruin. The British government had insisted early in the war that the RAF was forbidden from attacking Berlin. Civilian areas were off limits. The war, they believed, must remain civilized. But on the night of August 23, 1940, everything changed. A formation of Heinkel he won. 111s returning from an attempt to bomb RAF airfields drifted off course. Navigational errors, possibly fatigue, brought them over London. A stick of bombs fell across the east, and destroying houses and killing civilians. Though the Germans insisted it was accidental, the effect on British morale was profound. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon receiving the report, stood silently for several moments. Then he announced quietly to his staff, "They bombed our capital. Tonight we shall bomb theirs." Hitler, however, was incensed by Britain's counterstrikes on industrial targets in Germany. He vowed that any attack on Berlin would be punished with overwhelming force. He believed the German people would never be touched by British bombs. Berlin, he declared, was invulnerable, but the RAF's Bomber Command saw an opportunity. The Germans had fully committed the Luftwaffe to daytime operations over Britain. Night fighter coverage in Germany was thin. Radar was still in its infancy. Flak batteries were untested. A daring long-range night raid on Berlin would not only rattle German morale, it could also force the Luftwaffe to pull resources away from the Battle of Britain. Still, the operation was fraught with peril. The distance to Berlin and back stretched the limits of the Wellington Bomber's operational range. Navigational uncertainties over the Baltic posed serious risks. And though the raid would be small in scale, its symbolic weight was enormous. A failure could embolden Hitler further. The crews understood all of this. They had studied the maps. They knew the likely enemy response. Yet the volunteers came forward. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Hammond, whose own younger brother had been killed during the retreat to Dunkirk. For the men preparing to fly the mission was not simply retaliation for London. It was a declaration that Britain would not bow, that the war could reach the enemy's heartland, and that Hitler's boasts of invincibility meant nothing. If the raid succeeded even marginally, the world would know that Germany was not beyond reach. And more importantly, so would Germany. Arthur Hammond had grown up in the inland fields of Leicestershire, the son of a railway foreman. From a young age, he had been fascinated with machines, bicycles, steam engines, and eventually the early biplanes that buzzed over the countryside between the wars. When he joined the RAF in 1935, the recruiters noted his calm temperament, his precision under stress, and a quiet confidence that seemed immune to chaos. But Hammond's calm was not indifference, it was discipline. When war broke out in 1939, he was assigned to No. 99 Squadron in France, flying ferry battles during the doomed defense of the Meuse crossings. In May 1940, his aircraft was hit by flak while covering the retreat toward Dunkirk. He landed on a makeshift strip near Gravelines. His navigator killed instantly, the canopy shattered. The memory haunted him, a lingering shadow he carried into every sortie. After evacuation to Britain, he transferred to a Wellington squadron. The twin-engine bomber, with its geodesic lattice structure designed by Barnes-Wallis, had a reputation for absorbing punishment and surviving heavy damage. Hammond trusted it, though he trusted his crew more. William Holt, his navigator, was only 22, but possessed an uncanny sense for celestial navigation. Kellen, the rear gunner, was a soft-spoken farmhand from Devon with extraordinary eyesight. Corporal Sutton, the wireless operator, could repair a broken transmitter in total darkness. They were not heroes, nor did they imagine themselves to be. They were simply men raised in ordinary homes, now thrust into a conflict too vast to fully comprehend. On the afternoon before the Berlin raid, Hammond wrote a brief letter to his mother. He noted the cold weather, the worsening state of his boots, and a mention that he hoped to be home by Christmas. He said nothing of the mission. After sealing the envelope, he paused for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the small metal mirror above his locker. He felt the heavy weight of responsibility not only for his own life, but for every man who would follow his voice in the air that night. Years later, historians would search for details about Hammond's personal thoughts before the raid. They would find no diary, no recorded interviews, no private notes. Only the memories of surviving crewmen who would later recall, "Jack never raised his voice, never panicked. When he spoke, you felt you'd survive." It was that calm certainty the men clung to as they boarded the Wellington. Hammond was not flying to change the war. He was flying because the mission had been ordered, because civilians had been killed in London, and because Britain needed anyone to prove the capital of Nazi Germany was not out of reach, and because deep inside he carried the unresolved grief of France and Dunkirk. If the war demanded one more sacrifice, he intended to meet it on his own terms. The weather deteriorated quickly as the Wellingtons approached the Danish coast. Clouds thickened into heavy banks that rocked the aircraft. Hammond steadied the controls, his eyes fixed on the dim glow of the artificial horizon. "Navigator, confirm bearing," he called. Holt crouched over the chart table, red lamp casting long shadows across the maps. "Course stable. We'll hit the Baltic in 20 minutes. The Baltic crossing was the most dangerous stretch of the mission. There were no landmarks, only black water and the distant flicker of lightning. One wrong heading could send them into Swedish airspace or back toward German coastal defenses. Inside the cramped fuselage, the crew felt the tension mount. The temperature dropped. Frost crept along the interior frame. The engines howled against the wind. Just after 23:15, they passed over the Danish coast, slipping across the Baltic under cloud cover. Several aircraft became separated by turbulence. Wireless chatter grew faint. Hammond tightened his grip on the controls. When the clouds finally broke, the sky opened to reveal the faint lights of northern Germany far below. Searchlights probed the darkness around Hamburg. Flak bursts flickered like dying stars. Hammond's voice came over the intercom. "Eyes sharp, gunners. We re-entering enemy airspace. At 01:00 hours they reached the outskirts of Berlin. The city stretched beneath them like a vast dark sea. The blackout was nearly total. Only the faint lines of rivers and railways hinted at its enormity. Then suddenly searchlights snapped to life. Dozens of white beams swept the sky, crossing and recrossing in frantic arcs. A flak battery near Tempelhof opened fire, sending glowing shells spiraling upward. Luftwaffe crews, shocked by the unexpected intrusion, scrambled to their guns. Hammond descended to bombing altitude. "Bomb doors open," he ordered. The aircraft shuddered as the doors yawned wide beneath them. Holt leaned over the bomb site. Steady, steady. Target in view. Berlin's western districts glimmered faintly in the darkness. Though many bombs would fall off target in the chaos, the psychological blow was more important than accuracy. "Release," Holt shouted. The Wellington lurched upward as the bombs dropped into the night. Explosions rippled across the city, scattered small but unmistakable. Britain had struck Berlin. Flak erupted around them. A shell burst off the port wing, rocking the aircraft violently. Port engine losing pressure, Reeves shouted. Hammond fought the controls, leveling the bomber as shrapnel tore through the fuselage. Kellan fired bursts from the rear turret, keeping a Bf-110 night fighter at bay. For 30 harrowing minutes, the sky above Berlin became a crucible of smoke, searchlights, and explosions. Yet one by one, the Wellingtons clawed their way free, turning west for the long journey home. Hammond looked over his shoulder at the faint glow, rising behind them, the burning outskirts of the capital of the Reich. For the first time since the war began, the myth of German invulnerability had cracked. The return journey was grueling. The damaged port engine threatened to stall. The wind shifted sharply over the Baltic, pushing them off course. Navigation became a battle against exhaustion. Behind them, one Wellington from another squadron failed to escape Berlin's flak belt and crashed into the outskirts of Köpenick. Another ditched in the Baltic, its crew later rescued by a Danish fishing vessel. Several others returned with severe damage, riddled with holes, landing gear, jammed fuel, nearly exhausted. Hammond's aircraft limped across the North Sea as dawn approached. Radio static crackled. Fuel ran dangerously low. Jack Holt called, voice trembling, "If we drop any further, we hit the water." Hammond nodded, adjusting the throttle. "Hold her steady. Britain's out there." At 05, 40 hours, the faint outline of the English coastline emerged through morning haze. The crew exhaled in relief. Exhausted, battered, half-frozen, they made their final descent. The landing gear buckled on impact, and the Wellington skidded across the runway, its left wheel collapsed, sparks trailing behind. But they survived. By sunrise, news of the raid had reached London. Churchill was briefed immediately. Yes, he said quietly, they came through. German radio, however, denied the attack entirely. Joseph Goebbels insisted the RAF had failed to reach Berlin. But ordinary Berliners had heard the explosions. They had seen the fires. Hitler was furious. He ordered the Luftwaffe to shift strategic bombing toward British cities, beginning the Blitz. In military terms, the raid had done limited physical damage. But strategically, psychologically, and politically, its impact was enormous. A small group of British airmen had proven that Germany's capital was vulnerable. Historians still debate the immediate military value of the first Berlin raid. The bombs fell widely. The infrastructure damage was minimal. No major military facilities were destroyed, and yet, the raid forced Hitler to redirect the Luftwaffe from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London and other cities. This shift gave Fighter Command crucial breathing room, time to repair airfields, regroup, and survive the Battle of Britain. It also shattered Hitler's promise that Berlin was untouchable. For the first time since the war began, German civilians felt the war coming home. The shock reverberated throughout the Reich, but for the men who flew that night, the legacy was more personal. Flight Lieutenant Hammond received a commendation for leadership under fire. His crew survived multiple missions afterward. But 3 months later, during a raid over the Ruhr, his Wellington was lost without a trace. His name remains on the Air Force's memorial at Runnymede. Their mission, like so many others in Bomber Command, was dangerous, exhausting, and often thankless. Many would not live to see victory. Yet they flew because the war demanded it, because each sortie carried the weight of national survival. The first raid on Berlin was not a turning point in the physical destruction of the Third Reich. It was a turning point in belief that Britain could strike back, that distance did not mean safety, that even the heart of Nazi power could be touched by the men who climbed into their bombers night after night. In the end, the story of August 25th, 1940 is not merely the story of bombs falling on Berlin. It is the story of a quiet airfield in East Anglia of exhausted crews who climbed into cold metal machines of a long Black Sea crossing of searchlights slicing the night sky, and of a nation refusing to surrender. As dawn broke over Britain, The returning Wellingtons lined the airfields one by one. Some limped in with shredded fabric skins. Others landed heavily on damaged tires. The ground crews rushed to greet each survivor, their faces pale from worry. Hammond's bomber sat at the end of the runway, smoke still drifting from the port engine. The crew climbed down slowly, stiff from cold and tension. No cheers greeted them, no applause. Only quiet handshakes, nods, and the hushed murmurs of men who understood exactly what it took to fly into the enemy's capital and come back alive. The sun rose over East Anglia, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Another day of war had begun. Fighters would scramble, sirens would sound, Britain would brace for whatever came next. But for one fragile moment the field was still. The mission had not ended the war. It had not destroyed Berlin, but it had done something else, something immeasurable. It had shown that courage could cross oceans of darkness, that determination could outfly fear, that even when Britain stood alone, there were men willing to climb into the night and carry the fight directly to the enemy. As Hammond looked across the field at the rows of bombers battered, but unbowed, he felt a quiet truth settle within him. Sometimes history shifts not through overwhelming force, but through a single act of defiance. A dozen bombers, a night without moonlight, a city that believed itself beyond reach, and the steady voice of a pilot who simply refused to turn away. The first RAF attack on Berlin was a whisper compared to the storms that would follow. But whispers can echo, and echoes can become turning points, for in that single night Britain spoke with unmistakable clarity. We will not yield, and the world listened.